Let's give a minute to settle down. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I appreciate the time. I actually cut my vacation short to be here for the opportunity to have friendly interrogations like this with folks like yourself.
Grateful for this, Jim, and it's good to be with you on stage. Thank you to Anya and the team for having me at the forum. Great opportunity to discuss all these issues we've already heard about.
So I want to press you, and this came up in the last conversation as well, on an issue that's going to probably come up in every panel here today, which is Europe's buildup of its own security to meet the threat from Russia, and also to meet this aspiration for a greater balance of contribution. A couple of months ago, I embarked on a very high readiness task force in the Baltic Sea with NATO. And a couple things struck me. One, as they noted, that those task forces are about twice as big as they used to be, as a demonstration of force presence, particularly in the East. But it also struck me, speaking, and there were half a dozen countries, it was a German flagship, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, Danish, and French in this task force, was that even with the talk of greater contributions, which is not insignificant by any means, the timeline to actually build the forces necessary is, of course, very long. I mean, you talk about building ships, you know that this is a multi-year timeline. So I wonder, in your view, and particularly given that France has had a larger military and larger contribution for some time, is NATO, is Europe actually growing its forces sufficiently to meet the Russia threat?
Well, look, I think it is a time of great challenges, and obviously those are times which are very demanding to all of us. But I think we heard from previous panelists that we are now organizing our forces, we are now building up capacities in a very consistent way. It's not between choosing NATO or choosing the EU, it's very much about how we combine our different capacities and how we not only build up a better military, but how we exercise and how we be able to be engaged into high-intensity conflicts. So, I mean, money matters, obviously. On our side, we will add 415 billion euros in our defense over the next 5 years. Most allies are reaching the threshold of 2% GDP dedicated to their defense. But, I mean, the rest is also important. Rebuilding our industries, funding innovation, being able to dispatch troops wherever they're needed. I'm taking an example. Romania wanted NATO to dispatch expeditionary force in its territory after Russia triggered the war in Ukraine. And we were able to send our soldiers and have our contingent operational in Romania in 1 week. And this is not a question of money. It is very much a question of, capacity. You have to operate with allies, partners, etc. So, in a sense, it's a very demanding time because we have everything to do in the same time, and that's what we're trying to do.
I went to Estonia on that trip as well, and they made the point that the new NATO defense plan for the Baltics is backed up not just with words, but, for instance, the timeline that a quick reaction force would get there if there, for instance, were Russian tanks rolling across the border. I do notice a difference, though. When I speak to Eastern European leaders, and I'm sure those in the audience have a similar experience, you speak to Eastern European leaders about the severity of the Russia threat, and then you speak to folks in the central or west of Europe. And by the way, Eastern European leaders will often say this. They're saying they don't get how bad it is, and that the threat of Russia attacking a NATO ally is real. Do you believe that Russia has a genuine threat to NATO allies in Eastern Europe, or that the membership, in effect, is a impregnable defense?
Yeah, I think Russia is a threat, and the evidence of this is what it is doing in Ukraine now. And what is absolutely critical is that Russia be defeated in Ukraine, so it not be tempted to attack other European allies and partners, whether they be NATO allies or EU partners or, other countries like Moldova, which was mentioned earlier, which is under strong pressure from Russia. But I mean, we're giving the example of what we can do together to be more robust and, in a sense, deter further Russian aggressions. That's what is happening in Moldova. I mean, Moldova was very sensitive to Russian pressure, and now Maya Sandu has been investing in the EU candidacy of her country. She has hosted a very important event last June, which was the European Political Community Summit, which was a gathering at the continental scale of all leaders. 40 countries participated and decided to cooperate on very concrete issues, etc. So there are many ways we can demonstrate solidarity and deter Russia from aggressing other European partners. But I mean, what matters most at the moment is that indeed Ukraine wins the war, whatever it means. But I mean, it means that Ukraine has to be on the offensive, has to be in a position of strength. So at a point, Russia admits defeat and we can build a more solid peace.
When I speak to US officials, they say that one lesson Russia has learned from Ukraine is that it stands no chance against a NATO ally, that in effect it fears that conflict. And I wonder if you share, because, for instance, you go to Tallinn, you won't hear the same thing. Do you believe that Russia fears a conflict with NATO?
Well, I mean, our experience is that Russia, and it may be a paradox, has taken precautions not to aggress any NATO ally or to avoid any, serious mistake targeting NATO territory. That's not per chance. I mean, it's really because, indeed, probably they fear an escalation they could not control. But we have learned a lot in the course of the last 16 months. You remember that, our concern at the very beginning of the war, and this concern remains, was not to trigger, in a sense, the Third World War with a direct confrontation with Russia. So our commitment was to support Ukraine with the best of our capacities and avoid escalation. I would say that 16 months later, we are less impressed or less, not concerned, but the threat that Putin represents is less pregnant. And we see it as, dangerous, radical, the situation remains volatile, but we are less afraid. And this is a big lesson from the last 16 months, I would say.
I don't want to ask you to speculate on the future of Putin and Russia, but I do want to ask this, because I had a briefing with a NATO partner ally maybe a week before the Prigozhin failed coup. And I asked, do you believe Putin is threatened internally? And the answer was not clear where that threat would come from. Of course, Prigozhin marches within 120 miles of Moscow. We know what followed. Does the West, does France, does NATO have contingency planning for another coup as they watch closely, or a new leader who might be better, but might be worse?
Well, to be honest, we can only speculate. But obviously, the impression is that a leader, the almighty Tsar of all Russias, who said the morning that he will punish the rebellion, that he will punish Prigozhin and meets with him in the afternoon, obviously sends a signal of weakness. And this is our impression that Russia is not as solid today as it was before. And obviously, I don't know of any leader who loses a war, which gets out of this war, winning internally. So there are good reasons to believe that indeed the Putin's regime is not crumbling, but is more fragile today than it was some months ago. But I would not, bet on regime change or a kind of major political shift in Russia. I would bet more on our own forces and our own capacity to have Ukraine win the war and put Putin on the back foot, so he will be obliged to acknowledge defeat. Then, when it comes to Prigozhin, we as French, we have seen this kind of influence developing in countries where we were fighting terrorism along with the US allies, EU partners like Mali or the Sahel. And the first Russian forces dispatched to all those very vulnerable African countries were mercenaries, Wagner in particular. And, there is a big lesson in what is happening in Ukraine today, which is that obviously Putin made a huge mistake, but he probably bet on our weakness, and we have demonstrated that after Georgia, after Syria, after all those mercenaries adventures in Africa, after Belarus, etc. I mean, no, I mean, it cannot work the way it used to work.
There's an impression, so now to France's position in Europe with the US and with regard to Russia and China, there's an impression in Washington that Macron deliberately puts daylight between French positions and US positions to strike, well, as a demonstration of power, but also perhaps at times a difference of opinion, not on a core issue such as Ukraine, but approaches. Is Macron deliberately striking a parallel path for France with regard to the EU, NATO, and the US?
Well, I think the starting point for President Macron is building a stronger Europe. I mean, his conviction is that if we want to remain relevant in today's world and tomorrow's world as French, as Europeans, etc., we need to be much more robust. We need to be operational and committed partners to the US and to many other partners, and we need to play our role, and we need to play it seriously. So we need a much more strategic approach to our environment, to the global challenges that we are facing together with the US. Take China, for example. China is a global challenge. It is a challenge for the US as well as for the EU, and we need on our side to be more capable, you know, to stand our own feet and be reliable for the US as well. So that's what we're trying to do. Build a better European capacity, and indeed, you know, there is kind of a strategic awakening in Europe today. We have elaborated a China strategy, we have a rare earths strategy, we have an Indo-Pacific strategy, we have, you know, articulated a big plan which is called EU, Repower EU, which is about funding innovation and defense industries and much more in Europe. So all this makes us stronger together in Europe, but also together with the US. So no, what the point is about ourselves, what we can do for ourselves, and the capacity we have to really partner with the US and not delegate to others the responsibility to care for Europe. And that's particularly important because war is back on the continent for the first time since the end of World War II, and because, you know, Europe, I mean, crises are getting closer and closer to Europe. We have Ukraine, certainly, but I mean, the situation in the Balkans is always a bit volatile. In the Syrian crisis, people realized that you could walk from Damascus to Paris or Berlin. You know, things are happening in Africa which have an impact on the Mediterranean region and the south of Europe. So, I mean, we need to be more robust. That's what President Macron means.
As you know, partners can disagree on issues. When I listened, and I wasn't alone in this, to the French president's comments when he left China regarding Taiwan, and I know there was, if not quite walking back, perhaps clarification of what exactly he was saying there, but it sounded to me like France, well, Macron was not so certain that the West wants to get into a war with China over Taiwan. Do you believe, you've heard President Biden say, I think now 4 times, that the US would defend Taiwan militarily. Would Europe? Do you think it would be a mistake for the US to go to war with China over Taiwan?
Well, I think the key components of our China policy or Taiwan policy are exactly the same as the US administration. We go by the principle of the One China policy, and we want a peaceful solution to the Taiwan issue. So we are exactly on the same foot. Then President Macron traveled to China at the moment when President Tsai was meeting the Congress leadership in California. There was a bit of volatility all around this. While we were visiting China, we had a French frigate crossing the Taiwan Strait, as we very regularly do every year, and we are probably the only Europeans to go there so often. So, I mean, we are ready. And we are ready to take our responsibility to, you know, to be with you in case of crisis. But I would say the point that President Macron made in this interview was about our capacity as Europeans. While, you know, we are engaged into a long, protracted, potentially long, protracted war in Ukraine, to fight on 2 fronts. But I mean, in terms of principle, solidarity, and what needs to be done, we're exactly on the same page. And what matters most at the moment is not, contingency planning is always important and critical, obviously, but what matters most is to deter China from taking action. And that was very much the core of the conversation that President Macron had with President Xi in China. And he conveyed very clearly the message that, you should not do it. And that will have a big price, that will, that will force us to go for massive sanctions, etc., and probably much more. So, the message was crystal clear, and I hope it was well understood.
Macron has made an effort to get China to be a useful player in finding a peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine over many months. In your view, is Beijing, is Xi Jinping a credible partner in a negotiation that might bring an end to this war?
Well, I'd like China to demonstrate that it is a credible partner in fixing...
You don't believe they've demonstrated that?
I don't have the evidence yet. But China is a permanent member of the Security Council, is close to Russia, as this kind of no-limits partnership with Russia, etc. At the same time, I would say their attitude could have been worse. They could have been much more explicitly engaged in this war. So we're at a point when we need to continue to deter them from getting more involved in this conflict. And then I don't believe a second that China will provide a solution for the war in Ukraine. For the war to stop, we only need Putin to withdraw, and we need Ukraine to basically beat the Russians in the ground, and then we need to build kind of a very solid negotiation framework in which we can bring partners from different constituencies, from the global south, including China, but not only China, certainly India has a role to play, and many others who can have an influence, and we can guarantee a solid peace for Ukraine. That's critically important because we have the experience of the Minsk Agreement and the violations of the Minsk Agreement by the Russians. Andrei Yermak referred to previous negotiations. We spent together countless hours trying to have the Russians abide by their commitments. So we need something more solid today, and probably we need more partners to team up with us in doing this. China included, but not China only.
Just quickly, has the West seen any evidence that China has armed Russia in any way in the war in Ukraine?
Well, yes, there are indications that they are doing things we would prefer them not to do. But at the point where we are, when the counteroffensive is beginning in the field, when everything is complicated, etc., what we need most is Chinese abstention. We cannot dream of China, acting like a Western country, but we need them to understand that Ukraine is not only a conflict somewhere in Europe, or the consequence of disagreements between Russia and NATO or whatever. We need them to understand that Ukraine is a conflict of global magnitude, and that we cannot offer Ukraine to lose for reasons of principle, but also for reasons which are very operational. And what is at stake for us in Ukraine is much more than Ukraine's sovereignty. It's very much about the stability of the world order, security in Europe, and our capacity to continue lead in many fora and instances.
Things that they shouldn't or you wouldn't want them to do. Could you be more specific?
The delivery of weapons, certainly. Economic support.
They're delivering weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine?
Well, kind of military equipments. They, as far as we know, they're not delivering massively military capacities to Russia. But we didn't know delivery.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a question on the Global South, which I think is too often underreported and ignored. And then I'm going to, because I made a promise to a friend in the audience that I was going to go to the audience at least for one question, and we're limited with time, but I'll come to the audience after the answer to this question. So if you have some thoughts, think about them. Global South, you hear a lot of talk about it, and you have genuine substantive programs like the new Global Financing Pact to help develop there. But is the West writ large losing the battle, as it were, in the Global South to China specifically, and perhaps to Russia to some degree?
Well, I think that, that's probably one of the elements which, one of the key issues we are dealing with at the moment. We experience a certain loneliness in defending Ukraine. Many African partners, for example, are telling us, you care so much about Ukraine, but what are you doing for the Kivus? Why didn't you care about, some conflict in Africa? What about Sudan today, etc.? The necessity that we do all what we can to avoid fragmentation or, a further rift between North and South is of critical importance. And we need to demonstrate that, again, we have this ability to address those many challenges, Ukraine for global reasons, and not only European or Western reasons, but that in the same time we remain capable of addressing the priority concerns of many countries in the South. And take Africa, for example. You mentioned the financial pact that we crafted in Paris last June. It's critically important. What we need is a financial shock. We need to de-risk investments in many fragile countries so they have a chance to catch up with the global economy and play a role in the future. So there are huge expectations, and we have to demonstrate that we are not concerned only about our own security and future or rivalry with China, but that we are able to articulate or to propose to have an offer for third countries and also create an alternative to what the Chinese are proposing. So whether it be development or energy or innovation, etc., we need something attractive for the global South, i.e. those countries who feel they do not really have a stake in what is happening in Ukraine today.
Yeah. Especially with the expiration of the grain deal, which has enormous potential consequences.
Yes, certainly. But the grain deal, just to remind you that 60% of Ukraine grain exports goes through what we call the solidarity lanes, which have been organized by the EU. So not to say that we don't need the grain deal to be renewed. We need the grain deal to be extended. But we have built a capacity to continue providing grains to international markets. But we need to take this very, very seriously. And not only grains, but also fertilizers and many other key components for agriculture.
You're okay to take a question from the audience?
Sure.
Okay, fantastic. Do we have someone? Please, over here. Maybe just ID yourself if you don't mind.
Hi, Virginia Boney from Amazon. One question is a follow-up of acknowledging that China is sending weapons to Russia. Is the EU having to consider secondary sanctions based on the most recent sanctions package that you've put together?
Well, sanctions are, our main instrument, our instrument to contain Russia and deter others from being involved in this conflict, whether it be China or others. We have a problem with sanctions being bypassed by many countries, and not only China. The US, Europe, and certain allies in the Indo-Pacific region are implementing sanctions. But we have a difficulty like countries like, which are so close to us, like Turkey, for example, are just, making money today because, Russian money doesn't flow any longer to EU countries, but goes to Turkey and many other countries. So, everybody has a responsibility, including China, but not only China.
Understood. Just one more, because it's Steve Clements.
Thank you so much. Steve Clements with Semaphore. Emmanuel, I heard President Macron recently say that instead of NATO membership for Ukraine, the best option is to bundle a bunch of bilateral security assurances and to deter Russia. That was, you nodded, but he did say that. How do you make it hard? How do you make that a hard deterrent in any compelling way against Russia?
No, but look, this is not and or option. We have to play all the instruments we have. NATO, the EU, and bilateral security guarantees that we can offer to Ukraine. The most basic security guarantee that we can give is weaponry, is I mean, advanced weapons, etc. We are doing this. You know, the cruise missiles that we recently sent to Ukraine were mentioned earlier, and we are always trying to do whatever we can. It may not be enough, but that's what we can give. In Vilnius, we gave Ukraine a very clear perspective about its membership in NATO. And we are ready to consider this. I mean, we were very much in support of, you know, credibilizing the perspective that Ukraine joins NATO. And this has to go also with EU membership. At conditions we need to refine together, because, you know, what is at stake when it comes to NATO is Article 5. If Ukraine is to join NATO now, it means that we collectively, and the US as well, we have to be ready to go to Ukraine and fight for Ukraine. Are we ready to do this? I mean, it's still a debate to be concluded. And I don't have the answer, but I'm very serious, and President Macron is perfectly clear about the perspective that Ukraine joins NATO. Then, meanwhile, what we need to do is to basically provide Ukraine with the capacity to win the war. So, I mean, I would say it is a sequence. Joining NATO now is not necessarily the best answer. The best answer is the equipment, the intelligence, the money we are transferring to Ukraine, which makes Ukraine strong and the winner at the end. But I mean, you know, EU and NATO are certainly very serious perspective, and it is about Ukraine, but many other European countries as well. You know, think of the Balkans and Moldova, as we said earlier.
Well, you have that same question even without the explicit security guarantee regarding military action over Taiwan. In interest of time, because Niamh is standing, Emmanuel Bonne, thanks so much. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Jim.
Appreciate it.